We're going to get started. So hi, everyone. Welcome to another Friday Discovery session. I'm Natalie Irwin, Director of Stakeholder Engagement here at Efficiency Canada. I hope everyone is in a great mood. They should be. Tomorrow is the first day of spring. So very exciting after a long winter, especially those of us in Canada. And I apologize to those of you in the East Coast this morning who got a huge dump of snow today. And hopefully it will just make when spring comes that much sweeter for you. A reminder to everyone, if you're joining us for the first time, to save your questions until the end. There are two ways to ask questions. One is you can raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask your question yourself. The second way is to use your Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and I can essentially narrate your question on your behalf. We do have one pretty hard rule, and that is no sales pitches. So this includes statements disguised as questions. That is the hard and fast rule. Other than that, everything's fair game. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome you, our guest speakers for today, who are going to talk about the state and provincial carbon pricing and implications for energy efficiency. Sorry, that was a tongue twister for me. And it was a recent report that Efficiency Canada did with ACEEE. And again, we're going to go over the report and with its authors here today. So we do have Steve Nadal, Executive Director, who's joining us from ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. And then we have James and Brennan, who are on our policy team here at Efficiency Canada. So again, welcome James, Brendan, and Steve, and I look forward to hearing what this report is all about.
So I'm going to present an overview of it, particularly with an emphasis on the US, and then James and Brendan will give a little bit more of a Canadian perspective. But I agree with Natalie. I am very happy that spring is about here. And yes, I know those in the Yukon or Alaska, you have another month at least. But for the rest of us, hopefully in the not too distant future, the weather will start getting nice. So as Natalie mentioned, we have a brand new report, state and provincial efforts to put a price on greenhouse gas emissions with implications for energy efficiency. It's a joint ACEEE Efficiency Canada report. There's the link to download it, but I believe these slides will be made available so you don't have to frantically jot it down or just Google anything vaguely resembling the report in title and it should follow up. This updates a report that we did with a little help from Brendan back in 2019, but the situation is definitely evolving rapidly. So we felt that an update is appropriate. So a lot of you may know this, but there's two main types of carbon pricing. One is a carbon fee or carbon tax. You know the price, it's so many dollars per ton, but you don't know how much impact it will have on emissions. Or you can do a cap and trade type program where you know the impact. You're going to get, an X% reduction at least because that's the cap, but you don't know how expensive the emissions allowances will be and therefore the cost. Those are the two main mechanisms. So in the US and Canada, between the two countries, about 37% of the population is covered by some type of carbon pricing. That includes all of Canada and about 30% of the US. In the US, it's primarily California and the Northeast, plus we have Boulder, Colorado, but that doesn't add that much to the population totals. As you can see in the US, we primarily have cap and trade so far, whereas in Canada, as I'm sure many of you know, it's primarily a carbon tax, sometimes federal, sometimes provincial, but we do have Quebec and Nova Scotia with cap and trade. This slide puts this into a little international perspective. This is from a World Bank report showing that as of this year, we're up to over 20% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions is covered by some type of carbon pricing. The really big ones are China began this year, and the European Union has had one since 2005. Japan's another big one. And when you add up some of the US and Canada, they also contribute as well. So we're up to over 20% of the world emissions. Next slide. There we go. So I'm going to talk about the two big items in the US. First is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Program, gas initiatives, sometimes called RGGI, RGGI. It's a cap and trade program just for the power sector. Began in 2009 and now covers 11 states in the Northeast from Virginia on north. The goal is to, original goal, or actually the second goal, they've had several goals, I keep revising it, but the most recent goal that was achieved was a 45% reduction below 2005 levels by 2020, which was met. And now they're going for another 30% reduction by 2030. Basically, there's a regional auction for emissions allowances, but then the money goes to the states and each of the states decides how to spend it. The bottom right pie chart shows spending across the region, varying by state, but just over half the money goes to energy efficiency across the states. The states have all committed to use at least a quarter of their proceeds for efficiency, but most of them do, roughly double that. There's also renewable energy investment. Direct bill means effectively some type of rebates to help cushion the impacts of the cost, et cetera. Evaluations have found that the emissions are down. It has lowered customer bills. It has lowered wholesale power prices. It has increased jobs and boosts in local economies. A lot of those impacts are due to efficiency because the efficiency investments create jobs, reduce the bills, soften power markets, et cetera. Because normally cap and trade might raise prices, but because they're recycling so much of it for efficiency, the net overall, according to multiple evaluations, is quite positive. Overall, the emissions are down quite a bit. Various econometric analyses estimate that about half of the regional emissions reductions are due to RGGI, the other half to various other policies. And this is a slide showing all the different auctions. We're closing in on the 50th auction. They have them quarterly, so 4 per year. As you can see, there's an emissions trend line, and emissions have gradually been going down. Prices were originally extremely low at the bottom, at the floor, but then they tightened the number of allowances and prices increased. And they periodically adjust the number of allowances. So you can see an increase, you can see a decrease, but they have definitely been raising the floor as well as raising the cap overall. And there's lots of details in this, which I won't go into. Other big program is the California Cap and Trade Program, began in 2013, likewise for the power sector, but expanded in 2015 to cover most emissions. It's about 75% of emissions in the state, transportation, much of the industrial, et cetera. Most allowances are auctioned, but prices have been quite low so far. Some allowances are distributed for free, and those are gradually phasing down. They also had a 2020 target that they met early, but various analyses have indicated that maybe 80% of the reductions are due to other policies and programs, only maybe 20% to cap and trade. By 2030, the targets really ramp up. The estimates, again, various analyses are that maybe the cap and trade will cause 38% of the needed reductions for the 2030 goal. They're going to need to do a lot more, and they're trying to figure out what that is now. How much of it will they do as part of cap and trade? How much will they do separately, such as major utility programs and various other things? I would note in particular in California, environmental justice has been a substantial issue, and significant funds are going to help address housing and various other environmental justice concerns. Some of that is, that's ramping up now, and it's not fully shown in this pie chart on spending. The biggest chunk there has gone to a high-speed rail project that they're building between LA and San Francisco. Low carbon vehicles has been significant, as has affordable housing. In California, not as much directly goes to energy efficiency. They have I recall correctly, roughly $1 billion a year going to utility energy efficiency programs, but that's outside of the cap and trade. And then Boulder has this is a city of about 90,000 who enacted a carbon tax on just the electric emissions. It brings in about 1.8 million a year that they use to fund their climate action plan. As you can see here, a lot of it goes for efficiency, whether it's commercial, industrial, residential, but some for renewables. And they've estimated that they've reduced their emissions by about 1 to 4%. It's a range over the period due to this. But the funding has helped them to do building performance standards, do incentive programs, do lots of different policies. They have a rental policy, et cetera. So it's been very helpful for that. And I would just note, without going into lots of details, quite a few other jurisdictions in the US have considered or are considering them, but so far it has not been enacted. I particularly note in Washington and Oregon, there were very strong attempts to enact carbon pricing. In Washington, it was a carbon tax, and there was 2 citizen initiatives, both of which got defeated. One of them basically rebated all the money, and the environmental group said, no, we need to invest in some improvement. The other basically spent all the money, and enough people said, no, we want some of it back. So there perhaps is a Goldilocks in between, but they haven't tried it yet. And likewise in Oregon, they were attempting to pass cap and trade, but the rural legislators primarily from the Republican Party said, no, we think it will really hurt us. And they left the state to prevent the legislature from having a quorum and passing things. So now they're attempting to do a lot of this administratively as opposed to with cap and trade. And with that, I think I turn it over to James to talk about things in Canada.
That's right. Thanks, Steve. So James Gaede here, Senior Research Associate at Efficiency Canada. I'm going to briefly talk about the status of carbon pricing in Canada, and as well look at briefly where some of the proceeds are being spent on energy efficiency in some of the provinces. Okay, so as Steve mentioned earlier, all of Canada has a carbon price in place right now, but of course it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's the kind of the reason for there being a nationwide carbon price right now is because of a federal initiative to develop a system in 2018 that consisted of fuel charges on the one hand, but then on the other hand, an industrial output-based pricing system. The federal initiative was starting at $20 per ton, and then it was to increase to $50 per ton by 2022, and it recently been announced that they intend to increase it to $170 per ton by 2030. So part of the federal initiative that was announced in 2018 was that provinces had kind of 3 options. They could adopt the federal system as it stood and then keep the proceeds for themselves. They could develop their own systems as long as it met the requirements of the federal, what's called the federal backstop, or sorry, the federal benchmark kind of requirements. And if they did neither of those things, then they would be put, the federal backstop program, which is the federal program, would be imposed upon those provinces. Like, impose is a strong word, but essentially kind of what happened. And then in that case, the proceeds of the carbon tax would go to the federal government and not to the provincial government. Prior to that, there had been 4 provinces that had been kind of first movers or early movers in developing carbon pricing, only 2 of which still retain their original system. So British Columbia introduced a carbon tax back in 2009, and Ontario and Quebec both joined the cap and trade market with California in the mid 2000s or so. I think going a bit earlier for Quebec, and then in Alberta, a carbon levy of $30 a ton was put in place in 2017. In both Ontario and Alberta, the proceeds from those initiatives did support energy efficiency in the form of Energy Efficiency Alberta, which was a provincial energy efficiency program administrator in that province, supported by the funds from the carbon levy between 2017 and 2019, or sorry, yeah, maybe 2016 and 2019. And in Ontario, they supported the Green On energy efficiency programming. So when the provincial carbon pricing regimes were ended in both of those provinces, Alberta and Ontario, that also led to the end of Energy Efficiency Alberta and the Green On programs later on. So now we have a mix of kind of complicated mix of different pricing regimes across Canada. This chart just summarizes basically where there's a carbon tax in place for the fuel charges, and then what the nature of the administration is of the fuel charges or the accompanying industrial output-based pricing system. You can see most provinces have a carbon tax, only Nova Scotia and Quebec have a cap and trade system. And then on the administrative side, it's a little bit more complicated. Several provinces have the federal backstop plan put in place, but not always aligning also with the industrial side of things. So for example, in Alberta, the federal fuel charge applies, but the former carbon levy, or a component of the carbon levy that was applied to large emitters in Alberta continues to live on and is now known as the TIER, or the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Fund. So I'm not going to go through the whole table. I'm only showing it just to show that it's a little bit complicated in terms of who administers what parts of the overall carbon pricing system, and then that also impacts who has access and jurisdiction over the resulting proceeds. So quickly, I'm going to go through a little bit about how some of these funds are being used for energy efficiency. So in the for the proceeds resulting from the federally administered carbon tax, 90% of that is returned to consumers in the provinces from which it came. The other 10% goes to a climate action incentive fund, which is administered by the federal government and supports energy efficiency upgrades in small businesses and in the MUSH sector. The proceeds from the federal industrial output-based pricing system, it's yet to be determined exactly what they're going to do with those. So this is for provinces where the federal backstop industrial system is in place. And it's expected that they'll announce or clarify exactly what the procedure will be soon. It's likely going to be that the federal government will administer those funds and support projects in industry in the provinces from which those funds came from. So in Alberta, as I mentioned, the tier pricing system still exists, and some of the proceeds of this are going to support energy efficiency programs at Emissions Reductions Alberta. So when Efficiency Alberta was shut down in 2019, the existing programs were transferred to several different organizations in Alberta, one of which is Emissions Reductions Alberta. And so some of the funds do go to support emissions reductions programs at Emissions Reductions Alberta. Although energy efficiency is labeled as an eligible kind of project, there's no clear or a specified cut, like a specified amount that should go to energy efficiency. In British Columbia, the portion of the carbon tax paid above $30 per ton by industry goes to a Clean BC Industry Fund, which supports industrial energy efficiency projects. And in 2019 to 2020, this portion that was collected from industry above $30 per ton amounted to $12.5 million, 43% of which went to industrial efficiency projects. In New Brunswick, which has a provincially administered carbon tax system, they've kind of, the way that they've done it is to use, or I guess you could say, use the proceeds from the carbon price to allow them to reduce the fuel excise taxes to counteract the effect of the carbon price, I guess, and also to direct some of the proceeds to a climate fund that I think has yet to be used, although I recently came across some news articles that suggested that maybe some of it is being used to support small modular nuclear reactors, but I think that this is a recent development and deserves a little bit further investigation. In Newfoundland and Labrador, similar to New Brunswick, in that some of the proceeds are being used to offset a reduction in the excise tax. And there is a kind of commitment from the government to use some of the proceeds to match federal funding through the sorry, I forget the acronym now, the LCEF fund from the federal government to support energy efficiency, fuel switching, and industrial process improvements. Okay, moving on, Prince Edward Island, similar situation as the other two Atlantic provinces in that they've reduced some excise taxes and are using some of the proceeds to support measures to reduce costs for drivers, including, I think, paying for the registration costs of the vehicles or the license registration, which is an interesting way of doing it. In Saskatchewan, there is the federal fuel charge in place, but the province has a kind of halfway federal/provincial run industrial system. So Saskatchewan developed its own made in Saskatchewan industrial-based pricing system, but didn't apply it to electricity. So the federal government stepped in to cover that missing component. So it's a little bit of a mixture there. And Saskatchewan, the provincial government uses the proceeds to directs them into a Saskatchewan Technology Fund, which hasn't issued or hasn't received any payments, or at least should be receiving payments this year. In Nova Scotia, the proceeds are deposited into a green fund, and it was recently announced the use of the funds from the first kind of period. So in February 2021, this amounts to $28 million, 88% of which went to solar homes and efficiency for small business, low income, and multifamily housing. Just a small note that the figures in the report that we produced with the ACEEE might not actually match on this, but that's because the second component of this announcement was only announced after the paper was published. Just goes to show you that it is still a rapidly kind of developing scene, and so there's that. In Quebec, between 2013 and 2020, 90% of the proceeds went to support emissions reductions. The majority of that went to transportation, and now they've switched it a little bit so that the funds go to a different fund that's administered slightly differently, perhaps, called the Electrification and Climate Change Fund, which was administered by government. I'm going to stop there now because I realize that we're running short of time, and I'm going to turn it back to Steve to talk a little bit more about the role of energy efficiency in carbon pricing systems.
Okay, so James has been talking in detail about how some of these funds are used in Canada. I'm going to back up to 50,000 feet, about 15,000 meters up in elevation, and note that a carbon price it works with efficiency in a number of ways. One, if you raise the price, it improves the economics of energy efficiency investments. For the most part, these prices are pretty low and the impacts are probably pretty limited. But as Brendan will talk about, Canada is at least thinking of much more substantial fees that really could affect the economics of efficiency. Quite a few of the places in US as well as Canada are investing some of the proceeds in efficiency. Reggie is a prime example where they're spending half their funds on efficiency, and it really is achieving large benefits and effectively helping to cushion the effect of the carbon price on energy costs by softening the markets for electricity, but also by reducing bills because consumption is down. In some places, funds are being targeted particularly to underserved sectors, low, moderate income, rural, small businesses, and that's both in the US and Canada. I would say in the US, there's interest in increasing that substantially. For example, a number of states are now thinking about devoting the figure I see most often is 40% of their proceeds will be particularly targeted to low and moderate income households and communities. There are a lot of mechanisms to invest in efficiency, whether it's Boulder, which uses some of the money to help develop and implement policies, and Reggie, a lot of the money goes back to the utilities or other energy efficiency program implementers. Sometimes it's a state implementer, sometimes it's utilities to run programs. There are many ways to do this. And I would note in all these jurisdictions, yes, the carbon pricing scheme aids efficiency, but there's lots of other complementary policies that are being implemented, whether it's appliance standards, building codes, utility, state and provincial programs, low-income weatherization, et cetera. And as I noted, in the case of the RGGI states, the cap and trade is maybe causing half the reduction, these other things, the other half. In California, it's more like 80%, the other things, 20% cap and trade. I just give those two examples because we actually have studies estimating that. Next slide. I make a few other observations. Some of the programs have been in effect for more than a decade. British Columbia, RGGI, California is approaching a decade. And the evaluations, I'd say, have been quite positive in terms of how a reduced energy use and emissions while also providing other benefits. There hasn't been any evidence that I've seen that has really harmed the local economy. In the case of RGGI, there is evidence that it has actually helped the local economy. Most of the programs cover multiple sectors. In Canada, as James pointed out, it covers energy prices, industry, the power sector. In the US, at least the power sector, but in California, they're also covering transportation and industry. RGGI does cover just the power sector, but some of the same states are now in the process of finalizing what's called the Transportation Climate Initiative, which will be a cap and trade program for transportation related emissions. So even in the US with cap and trade, they're doing it that way. I would note also that the carbon pricing programs have been adopted under various political parties, whether it's the conservatives, liberals, New Democrats, Democrats or Republicans. All of them have played a role at various points in helping to adopt these various carbon pricing programs. However, I would note that the more conservative parties have been generally more constrained. In the US, it's been more moderate Republicans as opposed to far right Republicans. And I'll let Brendan comment on the Canadian situation. I would note that many jurisdictions have either established or are planning to establish some type of green fund to spend measures on programs that reduce emissions, whether it's efficiency programs or other reductions. James mentioned something about modular reactors, perhaps. Some states are starting to use it to help with adaptation to climate change or to advance natural resource conservation. That's been prominent in California, for example. And there have been some spending on job training and other programs for fossil fuel workers because we are trying to steadily reduce emissions, which will generally mean less fossil fuel jobs. I would note that the fees have generally been pretty modest so far. I'd say, in Canada, you're moving up to 25 Canadian dollars per ton. In the US, they've been a little bit lower, although yes, you have the exchange rate differences, but nothing too dramatic. But I'll leave it at that and let Brendan talk about where Canada may go. Take it away, Brendan.
Sure, I'm just going to very quickly talk about where we are a bit in the Canadian context. So as many of you probably know, in December, the new climate plan plans to increase our carbon price to $170 per ton by 2030. And I think it's important for us in Canada to continuously make the point that that rise in carbon pricing only makes the case for energy efficiency stronger, and more urgent. There's lots of elections that are going to be taking place between now and 2030, which will actually determine if we reach that level. And I think providing universal access to energy efficiency services so that people can reduce their carbon price burden is key to that. And that's one of the reasons why early this year, we launched a campaign on low-income energy efficiency in particular. And if you haven't already, we have a thing that you can sign. You can send a letter to your MP very quickly. I encourage you to do that. Having something like they have in the US weatherization program is quite key, I think, if we're moving to that level of carbon pricing. I'll also just note that, the politics of carbon pricing in Canada has not been easy. It's been quite volatile. James mentioned, Alberta, Ontario, we saw some major disruptions. And so certainly having multiple funding sources where carbon pricing, as well as, ratepayer funding sources, as well as other types of government funding sources now, perhaps Canada Infrastructure Bank, more funding coming from multiple levels has greater political resilience. And I think having that administrative complexity, perhaps of multiple funding sources, has some utility in terms of actually, maintaining efficiency delivery infrastructure. I'm going to leave it at that and just maybe make a final note that we didn't know how topical this report would become when we started working on it with Steve after the news of the rise in the carbon price and the new plan. And yeah, I'll leave it at that and see if there's any questions or discussion.
And if you can go to the next slide, there's some conclusions. I won't talk about them, we'll take questions, but people can look at them. A lot of that repeats what we said before.
Perfect. Thanks, Steve, and thanks, Brendan, and thank you, James, for joining us and sharing this, what turned out to be a very topical report that you guys were working on. Those reports do take time, although sometimes people think, oh, this is, so timely. They probably just spent, a week on it maybe, but it does take longer than that for sure. So a reminder to everyone, there are two ways to ask questions. One is raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask yourself. The second way is to type your question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I can essentially read or narrate your question on your behalf. I see Dave Stewart actually has a question. So Dave, I'm going to allow you to talk here. I'm going to unmute you if I can.
Hello.
Go for it, Dave.
PEI, as I say, just announced the new electric vehicle initiative, and just a couple of weeks ago, the Premier of Nova Scotia announced electric vehicle incentives. I'm just wondering how these incentives will basically shift to cause more green electricity projects to be developed, accelerate the energy efficiency, because I mean, if you're going to go to electric vehicles, the electricity's got to come from somewhere. Just a general comment about where electric vehicles and energy efficiency are going to fit together.
I will make one comment, but then let Brendan or James fall in. Yes, electric vehicles will use electricity. Likewise, there's a bit of a move to start moving space heating and water heating to heat pumps, which will also increase electricity if they replace oil, gas, or propane. But if you do efficiency, that will reduce the amount of increase needed. We've seen studies, maybe if you do robust efficiency, the electric demand may increase 20%, as opposed to if you don't and you use very robust estimates, it could double. So we're in strong favor of using efficiency to help reduce that increase, because new power, new transmission and distribution is expensive. And yes, we will need some. The power needs will go up, but let's try to keep that increase down to moderate levels.
Brendan or James, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I'll just make a brief comment. It's interesting, especially the EV incentives coming from the maritime provinces, which at least in Nova Scotia and then PEI linked to New Brunswick have had fairly fossil intensive grids. I mean, they're cleaning up their grids quite rapidly, which gives them an opportunity to do that. But those provinces also have, if you look at our scorecard, they tend to underperform on electric vehicles, and they are in the top performers on electricity savings. So that electricity saving potential they have and experience they have is going to really allow us to, use the clean electricity that we have much more smartly, right? Going into transportation. Basically the same thing that Steve just said.
Exactly. So James, I'm assume you guys are all in agreement on this one. So I'm going to jump to the next question here. Brendan actually has a question, are there any studies on best use of carbon tax earnings?
Steve, you want to take that one? Our study, I guess, makes a conclusion on that.
Right. I mean, I certainly would say the Reggie results show lead with efficiency. They've had by far the best results that I've seen in North America. We've also done some looking at programs in Europe, and likewise, if you use a significant amount to efficiency, that really helps achieve important benefits and moderate the some of the potentially negative things about higher energy prices. But other than that, I would say try to get consensus. It's a lot of money potentially, and to the extent you can get consensus, that really helps, particularly since political control periodically bounces back and forth, whether it's at the state, provincial, or federal levels. That would be something else that's important. So those are a few things.
Thanks, Steve. I see there's a question here from the audience, our listeners, viewers here today, on should we advocate more for hydrogen generation to replace fossil fuels in other areas other than electricity generation? So I'm going to actually answer that question on behalf of Efficiency Nova Scotia, but James and Brendan are welcome to add. For Efficiency Canada, we're pro energy efficiency. We're really not anti anything else. Personal views, anyone can do whatever they choose, but really we are pro energy efficiency, and we think energy efficiency is fantastic, and it's a great way to lower the demand that's needed for energy use and a way to combat the increasing of energy. So I don't know, Brendan and James, you want to add anything to that, or you're good? Steve, how does ACEEE have a similar stance, or are you guys active?
So we are fairly active on efficiency and decarbonization, and we don't favor any particular fuel, but we are very interested in efficiency and complementary policies to ultimately decarbonize 80% or more. And what we're finding from our various analyses, whether this is residential, commercial, industrial, or transportation, is do as much efficiency as you can, electrify where you can, because as the grid gets much cleaner due to renewables, nuclear, maybe carbon capture and storage, then that will really reduce the emissions. But you are going to need some fuels for certain hard to electrify uses, and that's where hydrogen or renewable natural gas may come in. Examples include heat. When the temperature gets below 0 Fahrenheit, heat pumps don't work as well. You probably want some type of fuel backup, natural gas, renewable natural gas. Maybe ultimately it's going to be hydrogen. Likewise, in industry, for things like high temperature, more than call it 200 degrees C, it's tough to do with a heat pump. You're probably going to need some type of fuel there. Likewise, with transportation, we're still not sure, but most of the studies I've seen said electric trucks, electric planes are probably going to be good to about 500 miles of traveling. Beyond that, you probably need some type of fuel to go farther. And then the question brought up power plants. And our sense is that a lot of it can be met with renewables, particularly if you combine wind, solar, and other sources. But you might want to generate some hydrogen during when you have extra power, nice sunny days, for example, or windy days, and put some aside, because during polar vortexes, you're going to want roughly 2 weeks of storage. Or run it through some power plants. And you may need it for peak demand at other times, but particularly battery storage is good for maybe 8 hours, but given periodic polar vortexes, you need 2 weeks of storage to get through some of these bad periods.
Yeah, that's a lot of great points there for sure. Especially what recently happened in Texas with
Yeah.
the outage that they've had there. I know a lot of people were happy to be EV owners at the time as they used that for heat. And I know some people were using their electric bicycles to charge their phones, which I thought was very innovative. We have a question here from Carrie. Is utility integration of energy efficiency programs are key mechanisms in most jurisdictions in Canada for lowering GHG emissions and reducing costs for customers. Alberta is the only jurisdiction without a mechanism in Canada right now. Is there information on how much utility integration in conjunction with carbon pricing and other mechanisms working together lower costs, reduces GHG emissions, and creates jobs? Go ahead, Brendan.
You wanted me to take that one? I mean, I think energy efficiency and different strategies of energy efficiency, no matter how funded, can all have those effects. But you certainly see in some of the states and provinces that do quite well on, are doing energy efficiency quite aggressively. So in Canada and Quebec, Quebec is leading in our scorecard on natural gas savings. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one reason is because they couple that utility ratepayer funding with funding from the cap and trade system. Same as in the New England Regi states, there's a combination there of the cap and trade funding and utility funding. I mean, I think Alberta is a great case of the political vulnerability of only relying on carbon pricing mechanisms. But there's also really interesting, some of the programs that Alberta ran had a different perspective. I mean, so for instance, their low income program was really, really focused on energy poverty as an objective. And, it went a lot deeper than in terms of savings than some of the other utility programs. So, I think there was an opportunity there to think about some of the program design differently, since the objectives could be GHG focused, energy poverty focused. But certainly, we see that multiple objectives attached with multiple funding sources is breeding, I think, policy success in both sides of the border.
It's almost policy resiliency. A question, because I'm cautious of the time here. I have a question for all three of you that I'd like you to answer. A lot of times people are very adamantly opposed to a carbon tax. So if you could have one statement in response, so not like a long, it's a quick elevator ride. So what quick response would you say to someone that is opposed to a carbon tax? And Brendan, I'm going to start with you.
I think we should pay for our pollution and then use that money more wisely to benefit society.
Steve?
We are going to have to decarbonize, and a carbon tax can be an important part of the solution. It is not the solution, but it is harder to decarbonize without one.
And James, for the closing.
Well, I guess I would say, at least in Canada, there's a good chance you're getting most, if not all, of what you paid on that carbon tax back in your pocket. And if you're not, then you've got an opportunity to do something about it. You have the agency to change some of the behaviors and products that you use so that your rebates do account for more of your total budget than they might otherwise. So.
Awesome. That's fantastic. It's a closing with a sales pitch for energy efficiency. I like that. So thank you again, James, Brendan, and Steve, for joining us today. Happy Friday. And I hope you're able to join us next week, because we're going to be joined actually by Jeannie Peters from Eco Canada, who's going to talk about their recently released report on workforce needs for energy efficient buildings. So Jeannie's actually going to focus on the capacity of the building sector's current workforce and the gaps that need to be filled as Canada's building transition to become more energy efficient. Happy Friday, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and happy spring and early spring tomorrow. Take care and bye.